Oh my goodness, everyone. Here we are. Another Wednesday, assuming you're watching on a Wednesday. That was awkward of me to assume what day of the week you are actually watching the Because Cannabis podcast. But if you're down with the cool kids, you are watching every Wednesday, 4:20 p.m. on YouTube, every Thursday on Spotify with video or anywhere that you listen to audio podcasts. My name is B.C. Wayman. This is the Because Cannabis podcast brought to you by Wayward Media. Today, though, usually there's two boxes on screen. Usually it's me, it's my ride or die, Dustin Kava. We're in here talking to some amazing guests every single week in the cannabis industry, of which today we have another one. I always am excited when I get to learn things about worlds I know nothing about. I love to dip my toe in them. I love to learn. I think it's a underappreciated thing that we are doing in 2023 since COVID. Someone commented to me recently that since COVID, the random art of awkward conversation has gone away. He's an awkward person who likes to make awkward moments. So he'll have an awkward random conversation with a person. Hey, how you doing? I like those shoes you're wearing. Can you believe the weather? Those types of things. But for some reason, seemingly a lot of folks these days brush that off. Going to push right past it. So the awkward conversation, talking with people you don't know about things you don't know and having them explain them to you, on top of talking about her amazing book, is a reason that we're here today. And I'm excited to share that with you here in just a few moments. I am alone today, though. I'm flying solo. Dustin Kava's not here. He's doing whatever Dustin Kava does. And I have found myself, despite my incessant need to desire companionship at all times, I have found myself the most often these days a little bit of alone. In fact, I recently went and got my library card. I hadn't had my library card in a very long time. I was going on a trip. I checked out a book. I didn't know Stephen King was still writing this. I got a book from the library, fairy tales. I'm like halfway through it. It's a pretty enjoyable read thus far. And I found myself thinking and then truly understanding the library is a fantastic place to go when you're high. It's so quiet, which you think would lead to instant paranoia. It's nothing but a lot of older people sitting around looking quietly at computers. It's a very sometimes hectic moment if you're there when school is not in session with little kids running around, but there's still this sense of eerie quiet. And when you're really high, it's a good vibe, man. I'm just telling you, I'm going to put it out there. If you haven't been to the library in a while, I'm assuming you consume, but if you haven't been to the library in a while, get a book, educate yourself, put the phones down. I'm going dad mode on. The stash is here. That means I'm in full dad mode now, offering you life advice. Hopefully I don't offer life advice to our guests, but if I do, it's probably good advice, right? So I'm offering life advice right now. Put the phones down, walk your little butt, drive your little butt, do whatever your little butt's got to do. Get into a library, renew your card, feel that sensation of reading a book in your hands. Just feel it, touch it, open it, the pages, the smell, the tactileness of it all. It's pretty enjoyable to do, though. I will say, actually, if I'm going to bring our guest in right now, if she's totally not paying attention, looking off screen, that's all right. That's what we do here. It's part of my goal, actually. Madison Margolin, welcome to the Because Cannabis podcast. Part of my goal is to always catch guests when they're doing other things. And so I'm one of these days, if I'm really good at marketing, which I'm not as good as you are, I need a good person like Zoe Wilder in my life. I need to get better at, I could probably have a collection of one of those clips of where we awkwardly bring everyone in on the show. I might get some hits, right? It might be a thing. Kids might dig it. I don't know.
Thanks for having me on. I was just putting my phone on do not disturb, so it wouldn't
That's
be
important, right? I just lectured you in dad mode about putting your phone down and having a full active listening conversation, Madison Margolin, where we are engaged in other people's total minds, like a mind meld of Vulcanness. But yeah, I have to imagine most people watching this are probably doing something else, right? I listen to podcasts. I was listening to a podcast yesterday, this murder mystery thing, as they all are wont to be these days. And I was doing like 6 things. I was, vacuuming and cleaning, ended up giving my daughter a bath while I kind of binged this whole thing. Do you think you get sad sometimes that the world just feels so busy that we are doing 19 things at once? Or do you like that? Do you thrive? You're a New Yorker. Do you thrive off the all the time?
No. It's diminishing returns. Yeah, it's way too much.
It can be. It can be. Madison Margolin, you're an author. You can check her out, madisonmargolin.com. You're also an author, and you can find a link to the book below, Exile and Ecstasy, Growing Up with Ram Dass and Coming of Age in the Jewish Psychedelic Underground. Super excited to have you on the show today. I got to start off with this, though. I typically, and maybe because I have very little religious overtones as a person, right? So I'm not really religious overall, but I tend to, and maybe between the media, being in a more rural area here in Ohio, you tend to find religion very much unassociated with drug use and consumption. And when we started to dig through the book, Dustin and I were both reading through the copy that we got, and he was talking about it, how we both were, I guess, shocked. And we'll start here, and we're going to dig into the book. You know, it's got some really great sections talking about your family, talking about Ram Dass, talking about this part, the fact that for a while now, I don't know, we'll say this best way, like a subsection of Judaism has been embracing plant medicine, right? We'll start there. Alternative uses, embracing those kind of religious shamanic type of experiences. I was really blown away to learn that. Is that a reaction you tend to get from people?
It depends who, but yeah, I mean, that was my reaction, 10 years ago when I first got into this scene. So, yeah.
It's an interesting thing though, right? To think about, like, all these folks have these really stereotypical of any situation, and you have all these stereotypical things when it comes to Judaism as well. Do you feel, is it fun to kind of try to break that myth? Do you feel frustrated sometimes? You get pissed off that people have these preconceived notions of you, or has it been a fun ride, kicking some doors down and really showcasing in your book Exile and Ecstasy that there is these other folks in there, and there is this use for different plants and other ways that some forms of religion are just so anti?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing, in Judaism, there's nothing anti about drug use or, mind-altering experiences or whatever. Like, there's wine, for instance, is so much a part of Jewish ritual at almost every holiday, and Friday night for Shabbat, or Friday and Saturday for Shabbat. So, I think it's really more that I enjoy showing people that there is like a space for this, and there is precedent for it, and philosophy around it, if you do want to kind of um, combine your mind altering experiences, and or specifically substance use, with Jewish ritual and practice.
And it is pretty incredible to start with. So let's go there. Let's start back. And this kind of, you talk about this a little bit in the beginning of the book. In fact, I heard another interview. I was watching something before we recorded, that you were not always enjoying the fact that you were putting a lot of your personal life into there, and it wasn't your initial goal to kind of really talk about your upbringing. But so many people responded well to the first portion of the book, which is this peek back. It is this curtain peeling look into what your life was like, but not just your life, what your parents' life was like, and see sometimes less than ideal situations that were happening and how that affected your upbringing. And then obviously these kind of realizations that happened. And then you kind of were like, oh shit, well, maybe I should put way more of myself into this writing, put way more self into what I was doing. Was it weird, or was it uncomfortable? Did your parents give you a side eye when you started to reveal some aspects of their lives, particularly some less than ideal aspects of their personal life?
Honestly, no. I mean, my parents were both really they took it really well. They're excited. They're just excited and happy for me that I was writing this book. And it's all honest. And they even said, like, well, you told the truth. Like, you didn't say anything that's not true. It's very accurate. And so, I think it is a very vulnerable position to like write about myself, write about my personal life, write about my family. But it's funny because my older sister just wrote a memoir a year or two before I did, and my dad also came out with a memoir recent. There's coming out with a memoir soon. So, um, that side of the family story is like all over the place anyway. And as far as my mom, like she's also a writer, and was just really supportive. So, yeah, and I think it was a really good opportunity for reflection for all of us.
Do you guys have to get together and check? Are there going to be some discrepancies between your sisters and then your father's like version of these events? Is this his chance to set the record straight? And be like, hold on a second, Madison, I'm going to fact check you a little bit here.
I don't think so. I mean, for instance, there were maybe like some fact checking things that like the grandparents, like, our grandfather was from, he called it White Russia, which I think was Belarus, but like in my sister's book, I think she just said like Russian immigrant or something. Um, so there was that, but she's a lot older than me and she's a weed lawyer, and a lot of her book is about, being fighting the drug war and being an attorney, and she's 14 years older than me, so the things that she remembers are much different than the things I remember, and the focus of her book is much different.
Yeah, you have, and I think that's something when you start to dive into not only the book, but then into your family's life. Your history with cannabis was probably foretold when your father, your father Bruce has kind of been involved in that, working some of the legislative angles back in California back in the day. So already a big part of that. And then obviously you and your sister come into it. So let's go for that. Let's start Madison. We're talking with Madison Margolin. You can find her book. Available now on Amazon. She's also with Davka Consulting, the co-founder of Double Blind Media. All those links are available below. Exile and Ecstasy, the link to purchase on Amazon right now. Find it in the description after you hit subscribe. Let's start there. Give the backstory, give your elevator pitch. We'll dig into the book, but for those just learning about it, what's kind of the pitch? Give the 30-second, the minute to get them fired up, and let's break it down.
Yeah, so I grew up in the community surrounding Ram Dass and the guru named Curly Baba. So my dad is my dad's 82 right now. So he started his law practice in the 60s, specifically focusing on cannabis law and criminal defense. And he, saw a lot of success with it, especially the 60s was a great time to get into drug law. And having dealt with death a lot in his life, both his brother and his father had died within 6 years of each other by the time my dad was 19. I think by 10 years later, my dad's 29 and he's like, okay, this is great. Like, I'm seeing success, but like, what's the point of life? And so he went on a sabbatical and ended up in India and accidentally met Ram Dass there. Ram Dass had just published Be Here Now. Ram Dass was basically this former professor, psychologist from Harvard, who had done a lot of psychedelic experimentation in the 60s there with Timothy Leary, and they'd gotten kicked out. His name was Richard Alpert at the time, or he was known as Richard Alpert at the time. Jewish guy from Boston, and ended up in India kind of looking for someone who could, like a guru or someone who could, forgot how he said it, like kind of like map the realms of consciousness. How do you sustain the high? Like, you go up, you come down on acid so many times, but how do you like maintain that sense of, how do you maintain that consciousness? And so, so my dad met him, and Ram Dass introduced my father to his guru named Curly Baba or Maharaji. And Ram Dass again was like a huge kind of devotee of the guru. That's what inspired Be Here Now and all his other work. And so my dad also became a devotee of the guru. And my childhood was really defined by the community of people who had been with the guru and were influenced by his teachings and by Ram Dass. And they were all also these like post-Holocaust, American Jews from New York and LA who, were maybe disillusioned with Judaism as they had been presented to it. It's like very dry, assimilated, not fun, whatever. There was also, I think, a lot of internalized anti-Semitism and people like being like, there's some level of fear for like being too Jewish or not wanting to really own that level of identity, especially for people growing up right after the Holocaust. And so but for me as the second generation of that, I was just looking at it being like, okay, so you guys couldn't connect to Hebrew. I get that, but now here you are chanting in Sanskrit, like you understand that language so well. And so I was very like snarky and eye rolly as a kid. And, it was like my parents were the the hippies on the block, and like the whole house smelled like weed all the time. And they'd have these like people in like robes and bindis like coming to like sit on pillows and chant, Hindu song, Hindu chants and songs. And I was like, can't you guys just be normal? That like
There's so many people who would like there's a lot of folks who probably are a little jealous about some of your upbringing, and you're like, God, can we just like have a white picket fence and a dog and make peanut butter and jelly in the morning, mom?
right, exactly. I mean, for as a kid, like that was like I was left out, like because
You
everyone.
always want the other side of it, right? And so even in that side, which you so have come to embrace and be part of, every kid, and I got 4 of them, every kid, even in the moment when it seems so good, they just want something else, right? I mean, it's all right.
Yeah. Yeah, it took me a while to, like, come to terms with it, and, eventually I realized when I was writing my college essays, you have to explain, like, the uniqueness of where you're coming from or whatever, and I was like, "Okay, well, I'm not coming from" like, on paper, I'm, like, a Caucasian, like, kid from Los Angeles, again, Jewish. I don't know if they really count that as, like, a legitimate I mean, it is a legitimate minority, but I don't know if that counts towards, like, adversity or whatever when you're applying to
Mhm.
colleges, um but I did have this very unique background, and that's what I wrote about in my college admissions essays, which got me to wake up to how that how lucky I was to come into something that is so unique.
I think one of the things that was interesting, and some of it was a little bit educational for me, learning, and someone who does, I'll say very poorly, but tries yoga. I appreciate trying to meditate as much as possible. I'm a very up here, like sativa and coffee kind of person, right? Like too much all the time, Madison. So I try to use those moments. And I talk about them like with my parents who are a little older and such, around the same age as yours, and they're like, "Ah, like who's stretching and this," and they just don't quite get it. But I love kind of thinking about where its origins came from, and then having someone like you and your family and those in your community doing things which I think are hugely beneficial, and I think can lead to a much more balanced, active listening brain, to put it back to where we were in the beginning, to have those things embedded to you from a young age. Uh, did the other kids think you're weird doing the yoga and the meditating? Did you feel like it was a good thing? I'm sure now it's probably great to have learned that skill early. What was it like to think about things, especially back then when yoga was very much considered like probably an evil thing to do? I'm sure people demonized it like as something weird and creepy and that type of thing. So just interesting to think about how it's come from when you were a kid and it's like part of childhood to when everyone kind of accepts it.
Well, it's funny because I feel like the whole culture of yoga has changed. Like when I was a kid going to yoga with my parents, you'd go to the yoga studio and they're burning incense and playing Krishna Das, and the classes are typically an hour and a half, and it had a lot more of that like hippie feel to it. There was like a spiritual element to yoga, and now you go to like it's like they're like athletic classes, and it's just like in
It is
out.
an athletic class now, and you gotta dress the part, man. You gotta have a water bottle with you. They gotta play, like, certain they do play the calming music, as much, but it definitely feels more like a jazzercise class sometimes than an experience, right? And I have had the fortunate, and sometimes it's even here, when there's, like, 2 types you can choose, even of yoga instruction, folks, on your YouTube. You can find it. There are ones that are more athletic, but there are some ones that are more traditional, and I like the calmness of it, right? I kind of like that vibe. Yoga's fantastic when you're consuming people. It's an amazing experience to be under any sort of visionary plant, cannabis or beyond. And then to be not only in that place of breathing, but in that place of like stretching joints and feeling that. And it's all about the hips. Just low key secret I learned. The more the hips kind of flex out, I think the lower the stress is in life. That's life advice again during the
I
show.
think your emotions are stored in your hips, actually. That's what they say.
I believe that. There's a lot of
Yeah.
emotion down in my hips, carrying a
Yeah,
lot of
I mean,
baggage.
I love yoga. That was the one thing that, like, I didn't resist. Like, everything else I resisted. Like, I wasn't gonna, like, start chanting with my parents. Like, I didn't really meditate. I hated it when people would tell me, "Be here now," and I'd be like, "No." Like, and, and it would be there, I would, like, just get so dissociated or, just whatever I could do to rebel against that. And again, there was a lot of stuff going on at home that was, like, stuff I didn't wanna, like, be here now for. It was, like, like, but yoga was the only thing that was like really real to me. I think I needed it. Like I have scoliosis, which is a curvature of the spine, and so we discovered that when I was 12, and my parents, I didn't want surgery or whatever, and I knew that I really needed to practice yoga in order to keep that in check and limber and whatever. So I took it seriously, and it really just changed my life. And it was the kind of thing where, like, when I was in high school, some of the cooler kids would start to be like going to yoga, and I was already like, oh, like I've been doing that since I'm 12. Um, and I did start to like own that as my thing. I think I actually started the yoga club and when I was like in 11th grade or something.
Wow, how industrious of you, the yoga club.
But you have like these little like lunchtime clubs during high school or whatever. So I would teach yoga to the boys baseball team.
That's fantastic. I feel like that's so ahead of the curve now. These days, in 2023, every professional sports team has like a yoga class and yoga advisors. The understanding and belief, even on an athletic reasoning, is very much important. Everyone talks about that in doing it. But I feel back then, the boys baseball team of several years ago, it feels a little above the curve. I feel like there's some schools where I'm at who probably think yoga is like still evil. So I don't know. It feels pretty ahead of the curve, Margolin. Madison.
Yeah, I didn't think I wish I'd approached the Major League Baseball at that point. I would be super
Yeah, man.
that idea.
Well, that's all right. You had other things in mind, and then that ended up to where you're at today, writing Exile and Ecstasy. You can find the link below to purchase the book on Amazon. So we're the Because Cannabis podcast, but you are not the first guest that we've had on as we begin to delve a little more into the visionary plant medicine. So we already talked, you had your father, Bruce. He was a cannabis lawyer. It makes sense, right, that you would be pro-cannabis, that you'd have that. California, obviously, the first state to have medicinal cannabis, because clearly the culture there and the ability to grow. But it went a step further, right? And so I think growing up, and maybe even growing up around a dad who's cool, who's a weed lawyer, to put it succinctly, is probably an interesting experience. But the psychedelic aspect, that had to have been a bit of a psychedelic experience. I mean, that had to have been something a little interesting. I think we all, especially several years ago, I feel even now, even psilocybin, ayahuasca, DMT. I mean, Joe Rogan can talk about it every once in a while, but it's still a very like, not sure, a few hippies out in Oregon are going to decriminalize, but that's about it kind of thing. But back then, to be very much ingrained into and to learn from your book how it was, I don't want to say normalized, but not weird. Let's talk about that. When was kind of the first time? And then how did you react to the understanding that it wasn't just like cannabis or weed, and a lot of kids experiment, but these more visionary plants that can have a much more intense emotional experience?
Yeah, so cannabis was sort of just part of the culture growing up, and there wasn't really a lot of stigma to it. I wasn't like, there was no rebellion to it either, like it wasn't like I could rebel by smoking weed. Like it was not a thing, I couldn't.
Yeah, no one, you can't get busted with pot, and your dad's like, where did you get this? And you're literally the definition of, I learned it from you, Dad, because you're a weed lawyer. He's like,
Yeah,
good.
But because my dad's a lawyer, he also wouldn't really let us smoke weed unless we had like a medical marijuana card or whatever.
Well, touche. Good for you, sir. Good, sir. That's a good dad.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't smoke that much as a teen. I mean, I think like whatever the kids in our family, in high school did whatever. But like, I was, I smoked weed like a few times in high school. I didn't really care. Like, I was just like, I've never been like such a like I've gone through periods of smoking weed a lot, but I've never been it's never been like my primary thing, if that makes sense.
You kind of, Madison, if you think about it real quick, and I want to get into the psychedelic introduction, but you kind of are an OG case study for normalization of cannabis growing up, right? What people fear today, we are here in Ohio. We just became recently the 24th state to legalize adult use. There's still harumphing in Congress about all these little nuances and things that are, we know, zero big deal. But the fact that I didn't really consume it, and it's like, because it was so like it was so normal, so basic that of course you can't eat. You're like, I don't need to rebel, because it's like, oh, okay. And I think that proves a lot to what it could be growing up culturally across any religion, across any background, across any ethnicity, easy for me to say, about normalizing it, just having open conversations, being like, here it is.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it's pretty amazing to hear you say that, and you just like, yeah, it's all right. And
Yeah,
most kids would be like, oh gosh.
I mean, I think my siblings like weed a lot more than I do. I mean, my older sister is like she really loves weed.
Oh,
Um,
now we're
you
tossing
know,
out some
so
barbs. Love it.
like I really, I might be the like the my siblings seem to be, but my brother maybe a little bit less, but like I seem to be the exception with the cannabis thing. But again, it was never like a taboo thing. It was just very much accepted. Psychedelics, on the other hand, my dad's like a very hardcore stoner, like that, not hardcore, but like that's his thing. He loves cannabis. He doesn't really do a lot of other stuff. He's kind of afraid of it. Even though he has had experiences with acid and mushrooms, and he's, sorry, there's this siren in the
No,
background.
you're in New York. That is just life as it happens. We've had a lot of noises in the background. We've had roosters, chickens, we've had arguments, fire engines, and stuff. Like, that's just part of life, folks.
Yeah. So my dad, it was, whether or not my dad was really into psychedelics. I mean, my mom for sure was, and she would tell us stories when I was a kid about like, I don't know, like passing out on angel dust in the east, in the Greenwich Village, and like being on acid in upstate New York, and like thinking she could fly and almost walking off a cliff. And I'm like, Mom, you're just nuts. Like even even in like in my experience now with psychedelics, I'm like, I've not heard stories like that. Like
No,
that's
I have not heard stories. It's that those sound like the Reefer Madness-esque stories of these types of drugs where, you're gonna start to plunder and pillage villages upon smoking your first toke kind of thing.
yeah. But I just was, I mean, I don't know. I had a sense for my mother, and I was like, I mean, I talk about it in the book. I just thought she was like, I was like, this is not the drugs you were taking. This is you. and, um, and, but, so anyways, everyone in my life, my parents, their friends, Ram Dass, obviously, everyone had been influenced by psychedelics, and the culture that I was steeped in was so psychedelic. Like it just was like the result of what it looks like when you're, now in your 40s, 50s, 60s, having done a lot of psychedelics in your life, and like
Mhm.
where does that take you? And so that was the climate of my childhood. And so, by the time I was 18, I really wanted to try, and got really into reading about them, and academically kind of exploring psychedelics. And then finally I did it when I was in college, and it really changed my life.
And it's interesting because it changed your life and it took you on this path. And then, would you say that as you went into this journey, which eventually led you to writing Exile and Ecstasy, that you became more embracing of the Judaism and more of the religion as you began to really understand it, and some of the other communities you even talk about in the book that use psychedelics? Would you say that it drove you more into it, or were you already pretty much um, fully embracing of the religion? I don't know if you're having a rebellious stage. I was curious how it managed to, I guess, how it managed to help you connect to your religion.
Yeah, totally. So I do think that the integration for a lot of people who do psychedelics is like, okay, like now how do I take this consciousness and like put it into a container and like live by it? And that was the path for Ram Dass, right? Like he'd done a lot of psychedelics, and Ram Dass, you could say, is a very religious person. His religion was he called himself a Hindu. It's all everyone I grew up with is a quote unquote Hindu, but like the religion was very much influenced by Hindu, Indian uh, philosophy and spirituality, and different rituals and practices and whatever. And that's really like religion to me, is like something that combines like this sort of spiritual sustenance and brings it down into like physical expression. So like I said, as a kid, I was like sort of rebellious. Like everyone had a Hindu name, even though they, like they're like, you'd have someone named like Steve or whatever, and having this whole other name. And
Sorry, it just I know just the way you said it, but it's like, hey, you have this very intricate, like lyrically beautiful name that kind of I can barely, because of my fat tongue in my mouth, pronounce. And then you're like, but he's also Steve. It just is kind of it's both beautiful and silly. But I think, as you probably learned, and even writing Exile and Ecstasy, there's some moments that are silly. If you can't laugh at yourself and have that kind of understanding of it, then relax a little.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a thing to have a spiritual name. You know, Jews were given a Hebrew name when we're born, you know, like even if we use our English names, like we also have Hebrew names. A lot of us, not everyone, I guess. But like, so, you know, it was just like that same concept, but now they were like doing it like with Hinduism too. But because I was rebellious, you know, like my parents sent me still to like Jewish preschool, Jewish Hebrew school, like, you know, I was getting a Jewish education, and then I was like coming home and like doing, you know, seeing them do kirtan in the living room. And, you know, I never really like, I never got a Hindu, I never had a Hindu name. Like I never fully connected, you know, I was like, because I was getting a very strong Jewish education. I mean, it wasn't like a quality education, but it was like very present in my life.
Sure.
Um, I identified as Jewish. I was like weirdly obsessed with the Holocaust when I was a kid,
Mm,
and you know, just was very aware of like my Jewishness.
sure.
And I think like, and it always felt like something also that was like a little bit um like above us in a way where like it kept everyone in check. Like it was something we had to answer to.
Hmm.
You know, it's like, okay, you know, Passover is coming up. Like we have to get in line and like see how like our family can come together and like honor this ritual. And, you know, there was an accountability factor from like, you know, grandparents and other family members too. Um, but with, you know, with the Hindu thing, there wasn't that same level of accountability because they were sort of like, I don't want to say like making it up as they went along, but like there was no authority, whereas Judaism kind of acted as this authority that they were all just rebelling from. But
Mhm.
at least my parents like still had enough respect for that they answered to it. And so I grew up very strongly identifying with that because, you know, I was rebellious toward my parents and all of their, you know, funny little affectations, but I did really believe in God, and they taught me to, you know, they taught me about God, and you know, I had this, you know, I was just like I wasn't gonna like mess with God, you know.
Yeah, sure. No, don't mess with God. I feel like that's good. That's another great life advice, folks. Hashtag don't mess with God. It's just
Yeah,
whether you believe or not, it just feels like why risk it? Right? Like
exactly.
why take the chance?
Yeah.
Uh
So, and you know, I liked it because all my friends that, you know, in school were Jewish, and like I could identify, you know, that was at least the thing that like I had in common with other people, you know, without all of the hippie stuff that my parents were doing. Again, I've at this point in my life, you know, people would call me a hippie too, but um
probably.
anyways, yeah, when I was in grad school, I came across these, like I was reporting on like the Hasidic community and came across a lot of people from that community doing psychedelics.
Oh, good Gesundheit.
Sorry.
That's all right. Work on some of that's the winter time in New York. Got to get that extra zinc in there, a little vitamin C, Madison, on top of your cannabis and psychedelics, just to bump up that immune system. We're just full of life advice today. I don't know what's happening. I didn't mean to offer that all to you. I apologize. You know, in Madison, it's interesting because you talk about all these different communities, and I think you have this kind of this silliness about you. I think a little bit in one of them. I'm going to pronounce it, and you're going to give me a hand here and help me. I think it's NaNach Breslov Hasidic
Oh,
community.
NaNach.
Is that
Yeah,
close? All right.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
only gonna say it once to help. I don't want to offend anyone out there because I'm
yeah.
terrible. Not a
No.
but it was in that moment, and this is kind of midway through the book of Exile and Ecstasy. You can find the link below in the description. It talks growing up with Ram Dass, a coming of age in the Jewish Psychedelic Underground. We have author Madison Margolin on with us. And so here, when you talk about this experience, and that is kind of where, once again, you talk about some of these stereotype communities and how they are embracing and silly, but it was really fascinated me was the I don't there's a name like the psychedelic trances that you began to observe and kind of go through, and it's a place that I sometimes am nervous to let myself go, and I found in this moment that feels like a community that's has a comforting supportive group around it that they're comfortable enough to let themselves fully go, fully embrace the moment, fully take their journey wherever it goes on a mental level to take it and to feel comfortable that you have a group of folks around you who will be there for you. And so you can fully let go, right? And such. And so I found that to be interesting. And I think it actually parallels to a little bit about what is happening in some of the legal psychedelic movements when you have these guides that are out there. You have some individuals, do your research, but you have some good organizations well who are giving folks, and we've seen some of the research that's coming out with ayahuasca, DMT, even MDMA, of resetting neurons, for a very simplistic scientific way to put it, and people walking away from addictions that they may have in their life, things like tobacco, other harder, more serious drugs, alcohol, or even anger, and these types of things. So I found it interesting, and really kind of, you could see how this community and what they're doing, it feels very ahead of the times, because this communal supportive group that allows people to fully embrace a visionary experience, and then you come out of it, I'm going to say better, that's a subjective term, but in a different place, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's really what got me, is like I I kind of stumbled upon these groups of ultra religious Jews, ultra Orthodox, but who were like the biggest hippies I'd met in my life.
Yeah,
You know,
that still struggles to wrap my brain around that. And it's my own preconceived stereotype and my own small worldness, I understand, but I think it's exciting for folks, I hope so, to see this. There's lots of layers to the old onion.
yeah, I mean, I highly recommend, just to wrap your head around it, like go on YouTube and I'll send you a few links or something.
Absolutely, yeah, I'd love it.
It's like something you've never seen before, like it really, there was like something so liberating about it, right? Like I was again, it's all these complexities and opposites kind of wrapped into one thing, like ultra religious but like fully liberated, like super hippie and super psychedelic, but also living like this very the word's not even, from the outside you would think it's rigid, but it's just orthodox. It's just like, this is the way we do things.
I was gonna
And
say like structured, more like regimented, right? It's not like rigid, but like I have a bit of like OCD. Like I like things a certain way. I do the same things. I eat the same breakfast every day. So that is a rigid, regimented lifestyle, but it's not weird. It's a healthy egg thing. It's not bad, right? So I think it's just regimented. And I think it's okay. And I think it's good for people to have a little bit of structure, and regimentedness. But it does sometimes, you're right, stereotypically not align with the psilocybin weed smoking, person.
well, I mean, I think like even in like the regimentation, there's a lot of flexibility. And it's also like the more that you don't even have to think about, like the more free you are, that frees you up to deal with other things. So it's like, like that's the thing also, is like if you're and they really live by, they have a sense of faith in God, and like comfort, they get this comfort from God. Like I've never seen people write off faith so much in my life. Like I wish I had such faith. It just nullifies fear. And I seeing that like way of living, I mean, and that's where the liberation comes from. It's like, just like it's in God's hands, and like let me just serve God. And like, how can I serve God? And like I'm, part of my service of God is connecting to, they also, the Rebbe guru culture is very much the same, where it's like, here you have this figure of a person, whether he's in body or passed on or whatever, where you kind of like, it becomes your channel to access God through the teachings of spiritual leader. And it really turned out that, like, having observed these Hasidic Jews in different places, whether it was Israel or Brooklyn or whatever, I was like, oh, this looks a lot like my family. There's this, like I said, like adherence to like a guru slash Rebbe. There's this sitting around together on the floor singing. There's just like this community that has an identity to it, and it feels like a family. A lot of different, and then a lot of the like guiding spiritual and religious philosophies around God, around presence, were kind of the same, just in different languages. And I was like, oh, okay, so the Jews who I grew up with, like the Hindus, had all been influenced by psychedelics and kind of arrived at this place, this philosophy, this way of life. And now here I am with these like Orthodox Jews who also had been the ones who I was hanging out with at least had been influenced by psychedelics. And whether it was like trance parties and acid and ketamine or Molly or whatever, or ayahuasca, ceremonial set situations, but they all kind of arrived at the same spiritual philosophical place.
Yeah.
And so which is why it was so easy for me to like draw that connection and feel comfortable in those spaces. And also the Jewish thing, like I couldn't rebel against it. And again, maybe because I didn't grow up Orthodox or anything like that. So it was like, for me, I was like, okay, this is the thing that my family actually respects, actually keeps them in line. You know, it was especially in a family where everyone was like fighting and getting divorced and this and that. It was like,
Yeah.
at least the Judaism aspect was very grounding. And so that's why I'm drawn to it and, you know, appreciate being around it. You know, even now.
It's interesting though, because before anyone would say, well, I feel like she is straying so far from some basic principles of your religion in Judaism, you have a section there where you talk about how these psychedelics, they're very similar, in your opinion, to going through, is it Shabbat? Did I say that right?
Mhm.
All right. So going through that experience, like having wine and sitting with a family and sharing that meal and that same, I guess the same outcome. I think what you feel is that experience of going through that, you kind of get the same outcome, different, but same outcome in these other experiences. And I think that was a cool realization as you get closer to the end of the book, that it's like everyone's kind of going to the same place, just sometimes taking slightly different vehicles, modes of transportation to get there.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I realized like, okay, like I maybe wouldn't have known what that place is without personally having done psychedelics, but then I noticed or observed that like other people through spiritual practice and discipline were kind of getting there too. And like that was again, that was Ram Dass's whole thing. Like, how can you get there on your own? Or, you know, how can you get there naturally, so to speak? That's not to say that like you shouldn't take psychedelics. It's just like let the psychedelics be the inspiration that then like you work toward getting there on your own after that, after you've been inspired, so to speak. So and it was like, you know, it was funny because Ram Dass also at the end of his life got back into Judaism, having rebelled from it when he was a kid in the 1930s, 40s. And you know, you just realize like so many of us, or so many American Jews who are not religious, reject Judaism because they, you know, there's so much fear around like standing out and being, you know, being persecuted and whatever, that like the parts of Judaism that are actually really cool and really like tripped out and shamanic or whatever have been sort of like pushed under the rug because it's like just be normal, don't stand out, do the bare minimum, like, you know, because people are afraid to be Jewish. And I think like what gets lost is like the whole essence and flavor and like, you know, nutrition of being Jewish. And you're just getting this like really like bland, you know, kind of pared down shadow of a religion, which is why people hate it and then just like run away from it.
Hmm.
And I went to Reform Hebrew school. I hated it. By some miracle, I never ran away from it. And I, you know, I was like, that was not the direction of my own personal rebellion. Um, and I'm really glad because, like I said to myself, even as a kid, I was like, what my parents are looking for in Hinduism, you know, which is not their religion, they're completely appropriating this whole thing, um, like from the Indians. I'm like, we've got to have like our mystical tradition in Judaism. Like we've got to have meditation practices. Like how could you not? Like anything where like God is so central. Like what are the actual practices of getting there, of relating or connecting to God? It's just that they don't want to look there because they hate themselves because they're self-hating Jews. Sorry,
Oh,
sorry, sorry, I don't even
it's a
see it.
your words, not my words kind of moment there.
Just kidding. They just have internalized anti-Semitism, which sometimes manifests in self.
Internalized I can't even say internalized easier for me to say. It sounds way better than self-hating Jews, if we're being honest. There,
Yeah.
for that, we are talking with Madison Margolin, author of Exile and Ecstasy, coming of age in growing up with Ram Dass and coming of age in the age of Jewish Psychedelic Underground. So, Madison, I really appreciate a lot of the information you talked about the book. It's available on Amazon. Let's talk a little bit before we go, just kind of where you're at now, right? I'm just curious. I know you've done a bunch of these podcasts. You've been on some interviews. You work with Double Blind. You have DACA Consulting. You can find the links to those below, along with Madison's website, where you can learn all about what the work she's doing. You've written for Rolling Stone and other places. So you kind of have this going on. You have this author, you're kind of getting the information. You're doing some speaking. I saw some different events. Looks like you're touring around the place, doing some book signings. What are you doing now? What's it like that you have all this out there? You've done a lot of the research. The book is out there. You should definitely pick it up. It's a great read. What is going to happen now? Are you just going to get there and promote? Are you going to keep journeying? I mean, where do you think you're going to go next besides obviously telling people to buy the book?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna try to breathe a little bit.
There you go.
It's
Because
been
it just came out, right? It just came out last November 7th, correct?
exactly a month ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a month and a day ago. So yeah, it's been exhausting.
Your Instagram looked exhausting. I was scoping the gram out this weekend before we spoke, and I was like, man, you're just all over the place, and you're doing all these speakings, and you have to do what you do here, which is kind of tell the same stuff again and again. You got to find new ways to say it, and you hope the person, I believe I was, is entertaining enough to kind of make it new, but it is repeating the same kind of stories again. It's telling the same stories. It's like a rock artist trying not to get bored entertaining the crowd and also, kind of selling your product. So I got to imagine just describing that sounds exhausting, but yeah, checking out your gram, you can find the link in the description. You look tired. That looks tiring to me. Like fun. Like it's like any rock, being a rock star is awesome, but it's also exhausting at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's where it's been at. I'm looking forward to I'm actually going to um I have to go to London for a conference, so I'm excited about that. And then I'll probably have some more book stuff in the new year, but I'm excited to just kind of land from all of this and just get back into my work. I have a lot of writing and stuff that I'm working on with Iron Press, who've really been supportive of giving a platform for a lot of this Jewish psychedelic content that goes, beyond the book and will probably be fodder for another book. So just trying to get back into the thing that I do, which is, it's funny. Someone said the same person who goes on the mountaintop and writes the book or is doing all the interviews is that now the same person who has to be promoting the book. And it's
Mhm.
I'm a creative person. I'm not so much a thank God for Zoe, because I'm personally I'm not good at publicity, or at least that's not my forte. Or
You are preaching to the choir on that one. It's hard sometimes. And when you're in that world, I mean, that's something that and not that in any level, when you see like an athlete or an actor or someone who media will rail on because they're not good at press conferences or they don't do a lot of interviews. And I'm like, how much do you want from them? Right. And they're giving you this content, or they're giving you this entertainment, or they're putting all their effort into this athletic endeavor. But you have to be, when you get into this world, especially it feels like in this era, like the ability to, take the content, make it shorter, get attention spans. I'm super frustrated, Zoe. We're over 100 episodes of this show, and the biggest view clip we have is a 25-second little clip I put of some little silly thing we had, because it was 20. I think it was 25 seconds. But then you do the math and you're like, well, 25 seconds times 5,000 actually equals this many hours versus, and so it becomes like, oh, I see it. So you got to constantly be out there. You have to constantly be telling people, but you have to create, right? You have to be a creative person and put it out there. And that is, it's tiring. So props to you, applaud to you. And then I don't blame you for trying to rest a little bit during this. Do you like that stuff though? Do you like talking? Do you like going and being a presenter and standing and holding court in front of a room? Or do you like more kind of a book signing Q&A intimate setting where it's a little more personal?
both, I guess. I mean, I I really believe in the messages in my book, so I really do want to put aside my own tiredness or shyness or whatever in order to just get the message out there. Um, so I'm into it. I like it. I just have to be in the right headspace for it.
I think that's all of us, right? Got to be in the right mode for it. We have been talking with Madison Margolin, author of Exile and Ecstasy. You can find the link on Amazon right now in the description below to purchase the book. You can check out the website, check out all the articles that you're going on. Anything new and cool coming up? Anything fun at all you got to tease out that you're working on? Or are you just going to go take a nap like a bear for the next 2 months till you go to London?
I have a couple more book projects that I'm working on right now. Again, follow my work with Iron Press. That's AYIN Press. because that's like where you'll find more of like just an expanded version of all the ideas that I'm, wrote about in my book and I'm writing about in the next 2 books that I've been working on. So yeah, just follow. I do try to keep up on the social media to keep people in the loop, and so Instagram is the place for that. And yeah, just buy the book, please.
Buy the book, please. Yeah. Plus, Billy gets on you, I'm sure, for the Instagram. Check it out. All the information's below. You're going to find a link to buy Exile and Ecstasy in the description. Give Madison your support. Madison Margolin, author and more. I really appreciate you being on the show today. I appreciate you kind of helping me understand. I'm kind of a dumb skull, so I like to learn. I like to learn from people. It's super informative and educational. So I thank you for that. And I just think it's a cool journey. I think it's a cool journey breaking down some of those barriers that people probably don't know about. So props to you for putting yourself out there. That's hard. That's hard as shit.
Yeah.
So props to you for putting yourself out there.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you so much. We're going to say goodbye to Madison. If you just listened and enjoyed the show, hit that subscription button below. Follow us socially. After you go to Madison's Instagram at MeetWM, you can find us on Instagram at Because Cannabis or at MeetWM, pretty much anywhere you follow social medias. Brand new episodes of the Because Cannabis podcast every Wednesday, 4:20 p.m. on YouTube. Thursdays with video. Oh yeah, we're right there with video and anywhere that you listen to audio podcasts. Don't forget, we have our series with Andrew D'Angelo out now. Want to talk about education, a free 90-minute educational series, 3-part series, 30 minutes each, of Andrew D'Angelo's consulting, entrepreneurial, and leadership advice, exclusively available from Wayward Media. Check that out, as well as episode 100 that we just released recently. Thank you guys for joining us. We will see you all next week.